Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on complicated charisma, gurus, new religious movements, and cults. You may notice that there's a little bit of a different background here. I was informed this morning as I was kind of prepping lectures and going over notes that my counters would be replaced in my apartment. Now, we've been waiting 6 months for that, so this was all a bit of a surprise, and I had to do a lot of kind of wild running around today getting ready for it. So we're in a different area of my apartment, such is life. Okay, so let's review a second. What is charisma? Well, Max Weber, the father of sociology, said charisma is a certain quality of an individual's personality by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. The mojo, the juju, the thing that makes someone special. I joked before that that's the difference between someone who has sort of sacred charisma, like the Dalai Lama, versus someone who has secular, non-religious charisma, like a Miley Cyrus or a Ryan Gosling. So these teachers, they have this mojo, this guru. So the charismatic teacher or guru has more than just good ideas or a compelling rhetoric or interesting things that guru has written. He has this power, he has this mojo. It's more than words and it's more than his teachings, but it's found in his very presence. These folks, and I will refer to them as male, are predominantly male, which says a lot about how our society views folks. And as I get to cults and cult leaders, you'll see that they are almost entirely male. Okay, so it's not necessarily that magic things happen around these gurus or these, remember I'm using guru as any sort of charismatic religious leader of a community. It's not just that magical things happen around them, though that might happen. They may perform miracles, or people might go into trance or have glossolalia where they speak in tongues. But a charismatic leader may be just a very exceptional or compelling speaker. The way these teachers and gurus speak is as important as what they say. They draw people towards their presence. Their presence and their performance adds weight to the message. As Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. But in fact, this is sort of true here, because the way the guru speaks, these charismatic speak and carry themselves, is in fact the message. And when you really get right down to it, a lot of these guys don't say anything all that really compelling or all that different from sort of perennial religious thought and pop psychology. If you read an awful lot of these guru figures, which I kind of like to do, you start noticing themes come up that are pretty repetitive. Okay, so what about miraculous gurus? So I said that there are some gurus that are just kind of, hey, they're very compelling and that draws people to them and they start a religious community, but it's the miraculous ones that really get things going. So in miraculous gurus, their presence inspires the miraculous or the magical. People around them, they go in, they experience the divine. They have unexpected trances, glossolalia, where they will speak in tongues or speak in languages they don't know, though linguistically, we've demonstrated that people that are speaking glossolalia are not speaking another language, but in fact, repeating sort of rhythmic phonemes that are actually connected to their native tongue. So these things actually really do happen. You could have a Protestant preacher like Benny Hinn down here in the center who may channel holy winds that knock people over. Now, somebody might be inspired by a charismatic preacher or become charismatic themselves and take up certain serpents or even heal people. It does happen. Now, the intriguing thing here is I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Protestant, and he went to a charismatic preacher having a revival, and he was brought up for the altar call where people are going to go up and take a profession of faith or have attest to the wisdom of what has occurred or their experience. And he told me, he's like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, I'm not getting knocked over. I'm not getting knocked over. I'm not getting knocked over. And he said that preacher came forward and just laid out his hands. He said, in the name of God. And he said, before the hand even got to him, he was boom on the ground. Stuff happens. So, yeah, when I talked about, and I'm going to talk more about Siddha Yoga, they talk about people having kriyas. Now, kriyas will be when someone has almost a spontaneous reaction to the guru. So they'll quake and they'll shake. They'll have spontaneous yoga poses. Sometimes they'll yell and scream. These kriyas are thought to be proof of Shaktipat, the descent of grace, which we'll talk about more in a minute, or proof of their faith and devotion. In my experience, when I've been in Siddha Yoga sort of gatherings in India and in the United States. I mean, I get the shakes and the quakes. It's really weird. I'm like, what's this coming from? So there's something about that, that environment that brings it out. But I mean, I don't doubt that these things really happen with people. And I remember one time I was in a basement in India and they were piping in the service that was going above. This was at a Siddha Yoga ashram. And I looked to my left and I looked to my right, and dudes just freaking out, like squirming and scrawling. People were like not restraining them, but holding them so they wouldn't hurt anyone. So, and then it started going more and more and more as I'm in this like crazy basement. And it was incredible. So I have one teacher who always used to say, the proof is in the pudding. So that meant whether someone has a miracle, well, that just shows the proof of their doctrine. Or is the proof in the pudding that you see that their disciples are so compelling and evolved? That's the proof. Proof is in the pudding. Now, Jeffrey Kripal talked about this as a sort of circuit, an electricity, the charisma circuit. The teacher is thought to be a conduit to the divine that can share that divinity with average persons. Kripal described them as almost being radioactive, and they radiate energy. The charismatic guru is like an electric circuit. The battery and bulb must be in a closed circuit. They must be linked in the same way the charismatic guru needs devotees. Any break will short circuit the system. The guru needs the context, needs the devotees need the context, need the guru. Is it that the guru completely connects and channels the divine, or that it's a product of the social context, or it's a product of them having fawning devotees? It's hard to say, but all three need to be there. The context, the guru, and the devotees. So we talked about how when a guru dies, they have to find a way to institutionalize the charisma. How can that charismatic nature of that guru be placed in the world? Well, there's a lot of ways you can do it, and the pictures here are of ISKCON. ISKCON is the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. They were started in the 1960s by an Indian guy named Prabhupada, who had very few Indian followers, but came to the US and became a big deal. After he died, they have his books. You can find them everywhere. Odds are you've probably met someone that's tried to sell you a Bhagavad Gita as it is by Swami Prabhupada. Don't bother reading it. It's terrible. His Sanskrit was never very good, and his commentary is awful. One Swami one time said, it's toilet paper. He said, you can go write a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita that will be better than Prabhupada's. But, you can also have you have scripture. You can have people become monks, like you have these young Hare Krishna monks. I've known a lot of Hare Krishna monks in my time, even in grad school. Or you can build religious art and religious architecture, like this ISKCON temple over to the right. Interestingly, about ISKCON, it was predominantly Westerners, but these days, and I have a friend doing research on this right now, we're finding more and more Indians that are into ISKCON. So, and they even have a Western guru now that's heading up the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. You may know them by another name, the Hare Krishnas. So in any group or new religious movement that has like a leader, especially one of these charismatic leaders, there are three levels. You have the ordinary members who are pretty much, they go to the services, they think it's cool, they get a lot out of it, it's great, whatever. They don't really have a dog in the fight. Then you have advanced disciples who have been there for a while, but they're not in the inner circle with the founder. And these people kind of tend to, they want to really propagate the order and bring other people in. Then at the highest level, you have the founder and their inner circle. The problem is that the people at the first level don't see the whole picture of the organization, because who can at the bottom of anything? The advanced are more complicit and invested in the group. And the founder and the inner circle are isolated. Because they're isolated, this tends to lead to them being more interested in propagating the group and getting power and money than they do actually attending to the needs of ordinary members. This hierarchy can be maintained in a number of levels. And some of them, like if you watch the documentary The Oath on HBO, you would see that people got different sashes that denoted the level they were in. In Scientology, whatever level you are in what they call the bridge, which is a diagram that explains attainment, and they'll put you at different levels. Or in, say, an organization called Shambhala, which is up here in Colorado, the guru at the time, Chogyam Trungpa, would give very special, it was a Tibetan Buddhist organization, would give special pins to denote their people's levels of attainment. And they would find, in fact, that people would be more furious in their devotion and in their practices trying to earn that higher pin or that better sash or going up the bridge. It's interesting how much these sort of extrinsic motivational things that we can see really used well in like marketing or behavioral modification are found in these cult groups. Okay, so let's talk about one specific religious group. I'm not really talking about a cult here. Let's talk about Swami Muktananda, who lived from 1908 to 1982. We saw him before. He was Da Free John or Baba Free John or Adi Da or whatever you choose to call him with whatever his phase of existence is. He was Franklin Jones's guru in many ways. So we read an article today in which Andrea Jain argues that Muktananda was a very modern guru. He crafted his organization and his ideology that he called Siddha Yoga for a transnational and Western-leaning audience. He knew he was appealing to Westerners and urban Indians. He calls it Siddha Yoga. Yoga means union. Siddha means perfection. The idea is that it is the yoga that is taught by the Siddhas, the perfected ones, and also by implication, a yoga that will perfect you and turn you into a Siddha. So he taught a sort of like modern Tantra yoga that he conceived as a meditation revolution that would sweep the world. At the same time that he was a traditional guru, he was also a tantrika, and he secretly performed sexual yoga. Now, a lot of people say he only did this at the end of his life with young women and girls. I don't know. Within the world of sadhus and tantrikas, the idea of doing sexual rituals with women is not it's not wrong in their world. And remember, they have this idea, like from yoga, of seminal retention. You need the power of the semen in the body. So they would do sexual rituals in which they wouldn't ejaculate. So take it what it is. That's their world. So what is the doctrine of Siddha Yoga most generally? Well, the guru here, Muktananda, can offer Shaktipat, the descent of Shakti, the feminine power. And then through the guru's grace or kripa, that Shakti will unfold in the devotee over time to confer liberation. One Swami in the order that I was hanging out in Ganeshpuri in India at one time told me that he didn't even do spiritual practice anymore. He was clearly a guy that just came by to talk to wackos like me who came in and kind of knew what they were talking about. He took me into a little room. We just chatted about spirituality and religion for a couple hours. I really enjoyed his company. There was no pressure on me. I mean, he was just a good guy, but I remember he had this funny argument because I kept thinking, I'm like, what are you doing here in this ashram? I mean, what's your day look like? And he said he met a lot of people and he organized social functions. And then I was like, well, then where do you find time to meditate? Because meditation is the key to the awakening, to the liberation experience. And he said, oh, I don't worry about it. Baba Muktananda awakened me, gave me Shaktipat. So now when I sleep, the Kundalini completely opens up and I'm fully realized. And when I go to sleep, it closes. And then when I wake up, it closes again. And I just go on with my day. I'm like, well, that's freaking convenient. I'm like, I want to get fully spiritually realized without having to do any meditation or spiritual practice. Anyway, so this Kundalini awakening, the rising of the serpent energy along the spine through all of the chakras or energy wheels, is thought to bring about realization of non-duality, that everything is consciousness just experiencing itself, and all of that is God. So what they've connected to is the Kundalini energy rising, and that simultaneously causing the Gnostic or mental change in which one will see that all is God, all is consciousness experiencing itself all the time. So they connect this subtle body practice of awakening this energy with also a Gnostic change of vision. So why we have to note that in Shaktipat, the idea is that the guru awakens that energy, usually by touching them. Muktananda would bonk people with feathers and then like pushing them on the forehead and boom, they'd awaken. The idea here is that the guru is almost not just awakening within you, but the power of the guru is able to go into you to awaken the Kundalini. Because he is awakened, he can touch you or look at you or give you a mantra, and that will plant the seed in you or awaken it within you. He enters into you and brings that up. The sexual implications that are somewhat obvious. Okay, so who is this Muktananda guy? Well, to understand Muktananda, the key is to understand Nityananda, his guru. And these are two of my favorite pictures of Nityananda. And I must admit, I have great love for Nityananda, who died in 1961. And when I'm in Ganeshpuri, I tend to actually be down in this grubby temple to Nityananda with all these like people who have been worshiping, not really worshiping, but devoted to him for years and their families. And I adore Nityananda. One time I was actually kind of grabbed off the street. People were like, yeah, you want to see a Nityananda video? And I'm ducking, this would have been in the 90s, and they pull out this like old beat up VHS. And it's these like actual like old filmed pictures of Nityananda walking around, and just, there was just something magical about it, because those, you can't even find them on YouTube at this point. Okay, so Muktananda was born into a wealthy family, but as a young boy, he supposedly saw this renunciate wandering around, and it was Nityananda. And he said that inspired him. So as a young man, he actually joined an order of sadhus. So sadhu means good. The sadhus are renunciates who are celibate. And he studied under a guy named Siddha Swami. Now, he took initiation and was given the name Muktananda. Muktananda means he who delights in the joy of liberation. And then he left. He just left this Shiva Siddharudha Swami, and he wandered for 10 years studying with different gurus, going on pilgrimages, learning all sorts of yoga. Note that at this point, he didn't join another he didn't join another order. He didn't become a Gosain. He didn't become a Nafta yogi. He didn't become a Dashnami. He didn't become any sort of specific affiliated sadhu monk, if you will. So he re-encounters Nityananda once he's completely grown up, and he considered Nityananda to be a god in and of himself. So he settled in Ganeshpuri, which is a small town just north of Mumbai, where Nityananda had basically settled, like in the early 20th century, and the town had grown up around him. So Nityananda, supposedly on his deathbed, conferred the power of the lineage and the ability to give Shaktipat to Muktananda. He did this by sticking his hand down his throat. So again, we have this idea of the guru enters the disciple and gives him a power to give that later Shaktipat, which is interesting. People in Ganeshpuri, and it's interesting to just hang out in the town and talk to them. A lot of people are like, that never happened. Nityananda never really liked Muktananda. So unlike any sort of religious community, there's always, you know, some hectoring and some backbiting. So how did he propagate further? Well, what do I mean by propagate, but to spread the religion? So Muktananda settled down in Ganeshpuri, and he received a wide range of Indian, mostly urban, kind of new school devotees, but also quite a few Western devotees, including Franklin Jones, our Adida. So the people of Ganeshpuri have varied degrees of love of Muktananda and the more current Siddha Yoga incarnation. So if you look to the left, that's what the Siddha Yoga temple looks like now. If you look to the right, that's what most of Ganeshpuri looks like. Siddha Yoga has, on a number of occasions, so Siddha Yoga is now the big organization that exists to this day. I've been told by several people in Ganeshpuri that Siddha Yoga has offered to basically tear down the town and rebuild it and rebuild new houses for everyone. And the townspeople are like, we don't trust you. So anyway, yes, and then the current leader is named Gurumayi Chidvilasananda. We'll get to her in just a second. A lot of the people in the town of Ganeshpuri feel that they transformed this little holy village into a cosmopolitan retreat site. In one hotel where I stay, they actually have a secret puja room, a worship room that is not public and definitely not for Westerners, because I've tried to get into it a couple of times, like, no, not for you. In which they do daily worships to a beautiful Nityananda statue. I just got lucky one time and I went by and I saw them doing it with the door open. They quickly saw me like, nope. So there's a whole still vibrant community about Nityananda there. And those people some of them are just like, you know what, we liked Muktananda, but Nityananda is the real source of things. It's funny how charisma lasts or doesn't, or does. Anyway, so the ashram, in fact, so what does ashram mean? A place of no work. Shram means to work or toil, ashram. The ashram resembled a Western retreat center rather than a traditional place where a guru would live. And Muktananda knew what he was doing. He built the place in a way to attract more and more Western and cosmopolitan Indians. So Siddha Yoga actually switched from being an Indian movement to a pan-Western movement. As we're going to see, Muktananda traveled all over the world and was very happy to establish a number of sites in the United States. They're some of the biggest sites today in the organization. He appealed to urban Indians and Westerners who could easily access the Guru teachings, pay for an intensive, and then have a religious experience. So here we have Muktananda on the right and Gurumayi Chidvilasananda, the current head of Siddha Yoga. What is an intensive? Well, this was the 70s. So they kind of understood what was going on in the world, where a lot of people were paying big money to go on these sort of spiritual or psychological or professional development retreats. So what Muktananda did was he set up a whole system where people would, pay some money, a couple $100, and then they would stay for several days or sometimes even one day. And there would be all of these like lectures, sometimes by professors who are devotees, sometimes by long-term devotees, people who would talk about the glories of the experience of being in Siddha Yoga and the glories of Muktananda. And then at the end of it, he would show up and he would wander around bonking people on the head with feathers and grabbing them and hitting them in touching them very quite lightly, looking at them, staring at them. And the idea was, after all that buildup and, hours and hours of chanting and singing, and the music is great at these things, Muktananda would come by and facilitate people having Shaktipat. He would awaken people and they'd go a little berserk. And they still go a little berserk, but everything's a little bit more staid these days, as we'll come to. So intensives were filled with these, where people would have these incredible experiences, and they would have spontaneous kriyas. I talked about that before, physical manifestations of devotion and the effects of Shaktipat. Today, they even do these intensives over the internet. Actually, I just checked, and they're mostly over the internet right now these days. Of course, I'm recording this in the time of COVID-19. All right, so the thing about these spiritual experiences in the intensives is they were available to anyone as long as they had the money and they could just get there. So the thing is, some people are going to freak out here. They're like, wait a minute, you charge for spiritual experiences? Well, Indians aren't bothered by that. We, like Western Protestants, are like, you should never exchange money for spiritual experiences. When you start studying with a guru, you always give them a guru dakshina, which means like a gift to the guru. So the idea of exchanging money for spiritual experiences is really very basic to Indian religions in general. So one of the things I wanted to make a point about these godmen, this Muktananda and Gurumayi Chidvilasananda, is they sell a solution to people who are removed from their families, their villages and traditional contacts. So Indians would move away from the villages into an urban environment, and they'd be like, well, how do I still do my religion? Well, they can meet a guru who says, this is how you do it. So in a sense, also with the miracles that they have, the music and whatnot, and the accoutrements of being a guru, they sort of re-enchant the world. Max Weber, again, argued that in the 19th century, there was a disenchantment of the world where the world became scientific instead of sort of magical. And he's like, this is a good thing. I begin to wonder about it. I think we all crave a little bit more magic and a little bit more meaning in our lives. So Muktananda toured and lived in the United States in 3 periods, 1970, and then from 1974 to 1976, and then from 1978 to 1981. Eventually he set up shop in New Fallsburg, New York, where the ashram, albeit in a diminished form, exists today. I say diminished form because Gurumayi is not the charismatic guru that Muktananda was. And for a while, she was really building everything up. And then in the early 2000s, she really kind of scrolled back and stopped being as involved. And the organization stopped really growing as much. A lot happened then. If you look at the early 2000s, there's a lot of shifts in the religious landscape around the world. Something I'm still thinking about quite a bit today, having lived through it. Okay, Muktananda had a sex scandal. They all have sex scandals, it seems like. That's why it always seems odd to me to call them scandals, because, it's humans. Humans have sex. Humans get up to no good. So anyway, toward the end of his life, Muktananda was performing sexual practices with a number of women and relatively young girls. And the reason for this is unclear. My money has always been that he was absorbing Shakti from these women that would keep his life going longer. Anyway, so what was the practice? Well, women have described this as being not quite sex. So what he would do is he would place his penis inside a woman and he would remain there unerect for a long period of time. Now, theoretically, he could have been pulling that Shakti, this feminine energy from women to gather power, perhaps, to keep himself alive. Now, at one point, Muktananda told a story about a guru who was critiqued for surrounding himself with women. Then that guru said, I'm done with this. Bring me a bucket. And he got the bucket out and he ejaculated in the bucket, filled it up, and he put his penis back in and sucked it back inside of him. This is called Vajroli Mudra, or the fountain pen technique. So what this points out is that sexual activity can still be continent, can still be brahmacharya, can still be, when I say continent, I mean maintaining celibacy, as long as someone doesn't ejaculate. This is common in Indian religions and Indian understandings of things. So furthermore, there are practices in which a man may suck up vaginal blood and fluid into himself to turbocharge his seminal retention practices. Now, Muktananda probably told this story about this guru in order to say, don't judge a guru. Just because he's hanging out with a bunch of ladies doesn't mean he's, he's having sex with them in the normal way. I see it as a tacit endorsement of the Tantra and yoga sexual practices that are found at the root of this. And if you look at the scriptures that they cite, that these Siddha Yogins cite when they describe their religion, they cite tantras that have all sorts of crazy stuff in it, like the Kularnava is one that they look at a lot, which is filled with sexual practices. But they manage to not cite those verses. So what about succession? This is kind of a great picture here because it's of Muktananda and Gurumayi Chidvilasananda on the right and Nityananda on the left, who we're going to hear about again. Not the old Nityananda, the new Nityananda. You'll also notice that Gurumayi's cheeks look a little different. We'll see other pictures of her later. This is a younger version. There's always been rumors that she was cosmetically enhanced to get her cheekbones to be more potent. She's definitely a striking human being. I remember the first time I met her just being bowled away by how elegant and beautiful she was. And she definitely cultivates her appearance in that way. Whereas I don't know, Muktananda always just looks like the lovable, scrubby guy that I'd want to hang out with. So we read for today, Liz Harris wrote a New Yorker piece called Oh Guru, 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 describing problems for Siddha Yoga in a modern age. And the biggest problem is succession. What do you do when a guru dies? Well, sex scandals had happened and they were made public. And this led to doubts about Muktananda's message, but also Liz Harris writes about there was actually a sex craze in the community. Because people are like, wait, Muktananda was doing this? We can try this. And if they had access to these scriptures, many of them were translated in English, though the translations were kind of terrible at the time. They're like, let's start doing this stuff. Gurumayi was not cool with that. Anyway, so right before Muktananda died, he declared that a brother and sister would be the co-heads of the order. Now, neither had the same sort of level of accomplishment or charisma of Muktananda, and it's unclear whether he did that Nityananda stick it down the throat thing to give you the power of the lineage thing. He also never declared them to be liberated. In fact, Nityananda, supposedly the first Nityananda, declared Muktananda liberated, so everything he did was kind of justified by that point. Muktananda never said that about his successors. So, at initiation, these two, the Shakti sister and brother, were given new names. So Nityananda, the younger one, I believe he was like 19 at the time, was given the name Nityananda. Kind of says maybe Muktananda wanted to have him be the successor since he gave him the same name as his own guru. And then you had a 27, 28-year-old woman who was named Gurumayi Chidvilasananda. So Gurumayi is just a title, which means one who is absorbed in the glories of the guru. And Chidvilasananda is something like she who delights in the playfulness of consciousness or the play of consciousness. So there was a rivalry. I mean, remember Nityananda was kind of on the young side. So Gurumayi Chidvilasananda had noticed a lot of problems with sexuality in their community at this point. So when it came out that her brother had violated his celibacy vow, she orchestrated him being falsely imprisoned, beaten by his accusers, and then expelled from Siddha Yoga. This shows sort of the dilemma of succession. It should be noted that though she is the current head, she has very little to do with giving teachings or giving Shaktipat at this point. She's just not very involved. Intriguingly, Nityananda, her brother up here on the right, was harassed for years. Siddha Yoga devotees would protest him, would attack him, would harass his devotees. So, and on this, and there's in fact one occasion where they beat him up and his devotees pretty badly and threw skunk oil all over them. Gurumayi may or may not have ordered this, but she was witness to having approved of it. Nityananda, in fact, cannot be found in any writings about Siddha Yoga and published by Siddha Yoga. You'll never see his pictures anywhere. So finding pictures of him together with Muktananda is even hard to find. They wanted to get rid of his very existence. And when I was active with Siddha Yoga, he was never mentioned in any way. It wasn't until a teacher of mine was like, you know about the brother? I'm like, what? So that's a whole story that's just not even talked about. So years later, Nityananda renewed his vows and set up his own modest ashram in upstate New York. So I have here, you have Nityananda and Gurumayi, and then you have Nityananda's house. It's a nice house. But at the bottom, that's just one of the many buildings in the Siddha Yoga ashram in New Fallsburg, let alone the giant ashram in Ganeshpuri that she is the head of. Nityananda interestingly says that Indians will ignore 50% of what a guru says and just do what they need to do in the world. But Westerners 100% submit, which leads to abuses by gurus and devotees doing troubling things to support their guru. And this gets to a greater point that Indians have this sort of like folklore, social catch-all against gurus' abuses that Westerners don't have. So when the guru says, submit to me, I will enlighten you, Westerners are like, I will do everything you say, you are the greatest God in the world. And Indians will be like, I don't know about you. I'll take my time. I'll take my time with you. Because a lot of you are sketchy. So let's move to something else. We're going to talk about Swamiji, who was a traditional guru in many ways. He's written about by Kirin Narayan, who we have on the right, who was born in Bombay. She's a folklorist trained in Berkeley and an ethnographer, and she wrote her PhD about folk tales in India, specifically about those told by this guru, Swamiji. Now, he has a full name, but she doesn't provide it because she wants to preserve his anonymity, which is fine. So Swamiji was known for being a really good guy. He was known for accepting everyone, never asking for money, and for being very accessible. He had a house that was sort of an ashram, sort of modest. People would come from all walks of life to hang out with him, to hear his stories, to get his advice, to ask him for holy water, whatever. He would do it all. He never had a scandal. He was just generally a good, pious guy. He would tell Westerners all the time, go home and look for God there. Why are you even in India? And he often depicted Westerners as being sort of gullible and taken in by false swamis. I'd like to give you a term here. It's shrammer. So you have an ashram, which is a place where there is no work. But I've often heard, especially one American journalist refers to people as shrammers, the glazed out, goofy, over-religious people, I was one once too, who wander around from guru to guru in India, being semi-ridiculous in every way and taking everything way too literally about mystic India. All right, so Swamiji was really accessible. In a way, there's this story about how a sadhu leaves his name and his family. When you renounce, you give up your name, you take on a new name. In some rituals, in some traditions, if you were a Vedic Brahmin, you would burn your sacrificial tools and perform your own funeral when you become a Swami. But in a way, the sadhu leaves his name and his family, but then he enters into the world even more. For now, the whole world is his family. Now, Swamiji was even known to give, to donate to charity and help folks. So I keep saying Swamiji. Swami means like Lord or Master or Sovereign, and Ji is just an honorific. So if you were talking to me and we were speaking in Hindi, you would call me Aaron Ji. Ji's my first name, you put Ji on it, and that makes it just sort of nice and sweet. So it's kind of like an honorific but somewhat familiar title. Like my friend, who's a great scholar in Benares, Mark Jichkowski, is just known as Mark Ji. You can go anywhere in India and ask for Mark Ji, and they'll show you to his house. He's a very, very good scholar of Sanskrit, and a hell of a sitar player, actually. So he had a small, he had a few Western devotees, and he had a lot of Indian disciples, and he lived in Nasik, which is sort of the same area that Muktananda was from. He had living quarters, a small kitchen, and a hall to meet people. It wasn't a big production. He was always known for telling fine tales. He was a traditional Shaiva enunciate in a specific order, the Dasnamis, but he was really dedicated to the female goddess that he just called the mother. Now, when we're reading about him, he gives us an emic perspective of the life of sadhus. What do I mean by emic? You have emic and edic. Emic, insider, edic, outsider. Emic would be, if I'm talking to someone about religion and they are a believer, what they say about the religion. Edic would be what, like a scholar like me would say. I'm going to read to you from page 79, so you can pause this video and get out page 79, or you can just listen to me read about Swamiji. So one other Swami says, though we leave our families, look what happens. The entire world becomes our family. Ironically, the act of renunciation may in fact push an ascetic into more extensive social involvement than if he or she remained a layperson. Sadhus and householders are in fact dependent on each other. Householders make the ascetic enterprise possible by providing material support. A sadhu receives offerings such as food, cloth, and cash from lay visitors. Some of these goods may be redistributed. The food is consecrated as prasad. So if you give Swamiji food, he'll bless it and then give a portion of it or all of it back to you. And prasad means like graceful substance. So it becomes edible grace, the edible blessings from the god, or if it's offered at a temple, or from the Swami or the Guru if you give it to them. The cloth and cash as gifts to the needies. But more important, from the householder's point of view, sadhus dispense blessings, teachings, and advice. Always take a blessing if you can get one. Dr. Ulrich says, always take a blessing if it's offered. Acting as religious teachers, ascetics give lay followers initiation or diksha in a particular spiritual practice, whether that's mantra, yantra, whatever, meditation. They are consulted on a range of mundane matters as well, ranging from sexual dysfunction to economic decisions. Many are folk healers and astrologers. As impartial third parties, they may be asked to settle disputes. A sadhu, in short, is someone who may be turned up to in times of need, and who serves as a spiritual advisor, doctor, lawyer, political commentator, counselor, entertainer, and psychotherapist, all rolled in one. We don't have time to read the next paragraph, but I highly recommend you do, because it's a really cool paragraph about all the kind of stuff that Swamiji does. So Swamiji tells a lot. I want to say, a sadhu in general is not necessarily a guru. In fact, most sadhus are just renunciate wanderers that don't really have any disciples. They are given alms to avoid curses and get blessings, but only few are true spiritual teachers. Swamiji tells a lot of stories that critique fake sadhus and gullible students, and I'm going to go through two of them right now. Excuse this painful image, but we're talking about the nose cutters. Nakarna. There was a guru, as Swamiji tells us, who would dress up like Vishnu. And then folk would come into the dark room and they would flash a light. The disciples would. And they would say, "Ha, you've seen darshan, you've had a vision of God." And people truly believed that was a vision of God. Now, this isn't too odd, in fact. I mean, you can go into temples and have it be completely dark, the flashlight, you have a split second where you see God, and then they shuttle you out. That's kind of a common thing, but it is a very striking experience that I recommend. So after that guru died, there was a thief in the area who had his nose cut off for thieving. People did often have their noses cut off, like having your hand cut off to mark you as a thief. He started to dance around and say that he had seen God since his nose had been cutting off, as if the cutting off of his nose caused visions. He convinced many people to cut off their noses and to see God. He ended up having many disciples, and his fame grew. Everyone he told, eventually, he told a king that he had seen God after his nose was cut off. The king suggests that he and all of his subjects have their noses cut off to see God, which is an inherently good thing. You want to see God, right? Anyway, the king's prime minister, it was a Brahmin Purohita, so like a spiritual and sort of military and magical advisor to the king, encourages him to wait for an auspicious time the next day to have his nose cut off. The Brahmin's father hears about this and hatches a plan. The next day, the Brahmin's father has his nose cut off. And when his nose is cut off, the guru whispers to him, because a guru, when he initiates someone, is going to whisper a mantra into your ear, saying that he should just pretend or everyone will just think he's a fool. And the old man says, "I see nothing. There is no God." So the military, or there is a God, but I didn't witness him by having my nose cut off because that'd be ridiculous. I mean, the nose does not get in the way of you seeing anything. Anyway, so he says he sees nothing. The military comes forward and beats the guru and beats all of his disciples, and they all admit that they had never seen anything. That in fact they'd had their noses cut off, and they didn't want to they wanted everybody to think they're fools for having their nose cut off, so they kept perpetuating this lie. This is a story you'll hear often. Swamiji says this is a real story, that it happened in India, that it really happened in India, and that this parable gives some weight. Now, interpretations are vague. Some say this is about not deceiving people by telling about cutting their noses off to see God. Others say it's a joke. Her mother tells a story that Swamiji told this story at a big ashram as a critique of the guru. In fact, she says that he gave an anti-cult talk in a cult. It seems clear to Narayan, and it seems clear to me, that the point of this story is about not trusting quick visions and charismatic gurus. Maybe don't trust a Muktananda. Swamiji says that God can be found everywhere, but only by wisdom and practices. Now, this story has parallels and a wide range of other Indic tales and other tropes. But the point is, When someone comes forward and tells you it's too good to be true, like you'll get the spiritual experience by just doing this thing, they're likely trying to trick you. So be careful and don't cut your nose off to see God. Just like they say in English, don't cut the nose off to spite the face. The next story he tells is about the greatness of lies. Here, the guru asks his 4 students, where does happiness lie? They answer by eating meat, bad character or sexual intercourse, doing big business, and telling lies. The guru notes that some happiness can be had by all of these, but lasting happiness cannot be found by any of these. A king is in the audience and he says, wait a minute. How can telling lies give joy? The guru says, hold my beer. Give me a year. So the guru grows a long beard, covers himself up with ash, and goes to another town. He's faking it, remember here. Sometimes in variants of this story, Swamiji says, it's like me. So he rents a big house and a hall and he installs an image of Vishnu. Remember the guru from the beginning of the first story who impersonated Vishnu and had it come to life? It all comes together. So he sends out disciples, so his spies pretty much, to tell that their guru will give a vision of the living God. One devoted woman really wants to see God. And the guru says that the God will only reveal himself to those who do not lie. You cannot lie. So she goes in for a while, and she comes out saying the God raised his hand. Another guy goes in, he says, oh yeah, I was in there for a while, and then the guru gave me his conch to drink out of. And it's more and more and more people. Finally, a king comes to see the God, and his wife goes in, comes and says, wow, look, hey, I saw God. So the king goes in, he comes out, and Swamiji doesn't say whether the guru lied or not. And says, look, king, you asked what greatness of a lie was, how a lie can be great. Everything I said was a lie. All the people who came here told lies. There was nothing. No one saw anything. So the point is, people will fake realization to not feel like fools. This is essential to understanding religious experience. Religious experiences are real. People do have them. They're amazing. But when everybody's having the same experiences, don't discount lying. Never discount lying. So the point of this story is not to say that God isn't real or that religion is false or that you shouldn't have a guru. These stories are to tell people to be careful and be discerning. Religious people are human and liable to failings, to trickery. Indians have these stories that are like stopgaps against cults. And while Indian gurus do sometimes turn into cult leaders, it is never to the same degree as the ones who go to the West or to Western cult leaders, who are not really all that realized, they're just selfish manipulators. So let's go look at some actual cults. Yes, so yeah, I had just said that. And I wanted to give you this example. That's Ramana Maharshi, probably the greatest guru of the 20th century. He barely said anything. Some are recorded. Some of his speeches are recorded, and they're just lovely. And he just didn't want anything from anyone. He just wanted people to come, sit by him, meditate, see the truth that all is one. Never would touch money, never got involved with any politics, never really started an organization. I feel like you kind of look at him, you can kind of see that. And behind him is actually the mountain where he lived, Tiruvannamalai, which is a beautiful retreat center, and I recommend going there. Okay, so we're going to talk about David Sullivan, the man who saves you from yourself. This is from a Harper's article that I read when it came out, and I always thought this would be a great thing to teach. So what are we talking about? I want to talk for a second about cults and new religious movements. When I talked about a new religious movement before, it's a religion with its roots in the modern era. When I say cult, it comes from the Latin cultus, which just means to worship. When I describe cults here, I mean something very, very specific, and that is high control organizations with charismatic leaders. I'm going to go through all of those terms, especially those leaders who use the organization for self-advance in money, sex, and power. So novelist Nathaniel Rich writes this article about David Sullivan, and he died literally like 4 days after the article came out, and it's really kind of sad because he's a really interesting character, as you can see from reading the article. All right, so who is David Sullivan? Well, he was raised in Boulder, Colorado, just north of me here in Denver, and had an interest in religions his whole life. Now, Boulder at the time in the 60s was filled with small religious groups, Buddhist meditators, all sorts of religious stuff was going on and he was just always interested in it. And so to some degree, he said he used to go to communes all over the United States. He was like, how do these guys get all these girls? I'm really curious how they get all these girls. So he's a very human character. So he'd always had an interest in religion, and he had some experiences talking to people in cults in the 1970s, and even talking people out of going to cults, sort of informal things. In fact, one of his friend's grandparents had their bags packed to go to French Guiana with the People's Temple, which is headed by Jim Jones. If you're not familiar with Jim Jones and Jonestown, once Jim Jones had gotten this kind of interesting organization, it was Christian and it was very much open to all the races and preached for racial mixing and hanging out and racial tolerance. But they left San Francisco, moved to French Guiana, founded sort of a commune, began to feel very intimidated, and then believed that the end times had come. Jim Jones had encouraged everyone to drink Kool-Aid filled with cyanide, and thousands of people died, men, women, and children. So when you hear the phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid, it's about Jim Jones. So David Sullivan, as a young man, found some people who were they were his friend's grandparents. They were on their way, and he talked them out of it, and that always stuck with him. So he ended up later in his life teaming up with Margaret Singer, who's down here on the left, who was an important psychologist working on cult movements and brainwashing techniques. And notably, they worked together to take down cults and help those that escaped these cults. Notably, Sullivan said that if you cannot get a person to be deprogrammed, your only choice is to take down the whole system. And he did, with a bunch of groups. And I think he was doing good work, maybe even God's work. Hard to say. So Sullivan used a number of techniques to deprogram people, but what is really key is what I'm about to tell you. He excelled at speaking with cult members and gaining their trust. He could be a chameleon. He would figure out how to talk to people exactly like he was an insider. And then he found that he could argue with them about various points of theology and whatnot, but that never did anything. So he'd get them talking, and then he'd say, you know what? Let's look at the power dynamics here. And that's when it would shift off. They tell a story in the article about this charismatic young Indian guy who was like, 14 years old, and he was installed to be like the next great guru. But his mother was always behind him, clucking after him and advising him and whatnot. And he found this woman who was completely devoted to this young guru and thought, this is I want to devote my whole life to him. And he said, you know what? You won't be serving that guru. Look at how his Mataji, his mother, behaves. You won't be working for him. You'll be working for her. And at that moment, boom, her head exploded. And when you really look at the way people get out of cults, it's never because they think the ideas are wrong. In fact, many people like ex-Scientologists talk about this all the time. Like, the beginning ideas are great. I still believe some of this stuff. But it's when they see the power differential and the power dynamics and the corruption, that's what really gets people out. So here's my caveat. Caveat emptor. Buyer beware. I am rarely really cynical about religions, but I am often cynical about religious organizations of all type. Big churches, little churches, cults, new religious movements. I don't trust people. I often tell people who are disillusioned when they come out of religious groups, because I talk to these people quite a bit, that they were naive to think of a religious group as anything more than a group of humans being humans. In fact, a friend of mine left a religious group I'm still kind of active with, and he was like, I thought these people had superpowers, and I thought they were, I'm like talking to this guy, he's explaining this to me, and he's like, I thought there was so much, I thought this was beyond any other religion, I thought the structure was beyond everything, I believed in all of this, and they ended up just screwing me. I'm like, they just did you like you're human. These are human beings. They're spoiled by power and desire and jealousy. Any religious group is just made up of humans. Don't put any more onto it. I'm about to be really cynical in the last part of this lecture, though. Okay, so I don't usually use the term cult, as I've said, because it has a negative connotation, and it's from this Latin word that just means to worship. So scholars use the term for these smaller groups called new religious movements. I think a better term for the word cult, as we say it all the time, is that it's a charismatic new religious movement. There are bad groups and there are good groups. There are new religious movements that are manipulative. There are some that aren't. I would say avoid looking at any religious group and say, that's just a cult, because what do you mean? Well, what do you mean? Let's be more specific. So what do I mean by a cult or a negative religious group or a negative new religious movement? So these are the characteristics that I would say that I look for when I would want to designate something as a negative religious movement, or, for lack of a better word, a cult. So negative groups use high control organization. They control people's money, they control their food, they control their sex, they control their time. They fill up their time all the time with meaningless tasks or service to the order, to the point that you are working 20 hours a day, barely sleeping. They'll often restrict your food. So a lot of the mind control, brainwashing, whatever, these techniques that people will use in sort of in their recruitment orders, is to restrict people's protein and feed them relatively high sugar foods. That just gets you out of your brain. So high control, I think this is the key one, a high control religious group. I have a friend who left a religious group recently and called it a low control cult, which it kind of was. But anyways, high control. Charismatic leaders that promote that high control. So the leaders or the leader just like tacitly says, we're going to have high control over you, and sets up systems so there's high control over the people that are members. Negative groups are secretive about their structures. You can't figure out how the different levels of the organization are working or who's working with who. If you're an ordinary person, you may only interact with the advanced disciples and never the inner circle or the founders. So they're very secretive about the structure of how things work and who's in what position. They extract money. They ask for your money. Like they just ask for a lot of money, whether that's they force you to buy books, or they force you to give donations, or they say, you know, if you want to move up this next level in the order, you need this donation of this, or to donate to this charity. They extract money. And those that stay in it for a while, who are no longer able to extract money from, maybe they'll get them in as advanced disciples and pay them, you know, $100 a month, but give them free rent. Say, I'll give you $100 a month, but you got to work for the order all the time. They get toward financial dependence instead of independence. Another thing you'll notice is that wealthy and influential people, PhD scholars as well, get easy access, whereas normal folks, especially not very good looking normal folks, take a long time to advance in the order. I definitely got access to things based on my education and scholarly presence with ease that has made me a little bit uncomfortable. What is not a sign? And I want to stress this: innovative teachings. If somebody, if they got a really interesting like set of doctrines and whatnot, that's not a sign of a negative religious movement. Okay, so the charisma of the founder really pulls people in. So here we've got Jim Jones on the right with Martin Luther King behind him. We have the glorious L. Ron Hubbard, founder of Scientology, having a bust of him made, and Keith Raniere, who's my new favorite obsession of a very Weasley Hobbit-looking cult man. Anyway, so the membership, the charisma of the founder pulls people in, but the structures that they set up institutionalize the charisma. Membership and performing the practices and lifestyle of the organization become more intense than the teachings. The teachings fade away. You're no longer interested in the doctrines and the teachings of the group. You're more interested in moving through the system, or making sure the system works, or making sure the group stays in power and stays robust. Folks start out saying it starts really well, but the group shifts from being about personal experience or charity to perpetuating the organization. One member of NXIVM has, Keith Raniere's group, has said nobody joins a cult. And a lot of scholars says, no one joins a cult. You join a good thing that you think is good for you and good for the world, but it changes, which is why you have to be discerning with any religious groups. Cults are usually organized around some charitable, religious, or personal growth idea. You don't join a cult, you join a good thing. Some groups are purely about personal growth without religious symbolism. You see this in NXIVM, and you see this in Scientology, that they don't use any traditional religious stuff. It's all about personal growth, but yet they use the same structures and manipulations of cults and religious groups. Supposedly there are up to 2 million people that are in cults today in the United States. Most of these cults are not that big of a deal. They're not that malicious. They don't end up having everyone dying. They're just small new religious movements for the most part with wacky leaders. So folks who leave these cults, though, in fact, no matter how benign the ideology, report that they fear reprisals. They fear that the people still in the group or the founders will send people after them. Folks in these groups are encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to harass suppressives. Suppressive person is a Scientology term, and it's a term that you find throughout religious groups now. That is someone who is trying to challenge the group or cannot accept the group. So someone who's labeled a suppressive person will be harassed by the organization. Now, examining cults and new religious movements and we're looking at their literature and looking at how they work, we observe that their ideologies are often quite the same, usually pop religion and psychology that's dressed up as innovative. And their techniques for running their organization is identical. Like I said, those categories of high control in particular. Their symbols, literatures, and jargon can differ, but the structure and philosophy are remarkably similar. So we have Marshall Applewhite on the left, and then we have, what's his name, the guy who's the head of the Children of God on the right. There is a tendency for these guys to be white, bearded, obsessed with aliens, obsessed with pedophilia, in fact, in the Children of God guy. We're not going to go into him too much, but you can see innumerable documentaries on him on your own. So you can learn to recognize a cult. Just look at that list of negative attributes of these religious movements that I listed before. These are signs of being in a cult. You can learn to recognize a cult or a manipulative, antisocial, new religious movement. A manipulative, antisocial, new religious movement is a bit of a mouthful even for me. But recruits, the people who are being recruited, don't have the background to recognize these patterns. They just see a good thing in compelling leadership. So Margaret Singer argued that there are two key aspects to a cult operation, to the operation of a cult, noting that cult leaders have the same skill sets as conmen, advertisers, and politicians. First off, recruits must never suspect they are being recruited. And the second thing is you got to monopolize their time. That gets them in here. There's an idea called progressive entrapment that you find in demonology that says that, people don't get possessed right away. And the same thing is with religious movements. It's like you put a frog in a pot of water. The frog is happy. If you turn up the heat right away, it'll jump right out. If you put him in boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you slowly turn up the heat, they'll boil alive. So Sullivan and Singer argue that the leaders are never true believers like their followers. In fact, their ideology is only matched to their personal desires, as you look at David Koresh, who manipulated his cult to allow him to sleep with young women, or Charles Manson, who definitely had a cult that was all about the ladies, and Keith Raniere as well. In the end of the day, he liked the money, and he kind of created a secretive underground group of submissive women who were very much under his power. Yes, so their ideology is matched by their own personal desires. And this is another thing to look at when you're looking at a religious groups. Like, do they seem to be giving forth ideology and philosophy that seems to support them and what they specifically desire more than anything? Specifically, are devotees only pretty women? Do they praise wealth? Is there an excess of wealth and comfort? I heard one guru one time say, I don't like to work with poor people because they're always worried about money. I like to work with rich people because they're not worried about money and they're worried about everything else. I'm like, I don't trust you one bit. So some folk at the top of this system, so the inner circle, will believe that the game is really about money and power, but they're so implicated in the system that they keep working toward it. The recruitment techniques are similar. You tear folk down and then build them up. Tear them down, build them up. Sullivan describes a Mormon-esque group that isolates folks for days, restricts their eating and sleeping, and humiliates them until they break. And then they build them up as reborn, as powerful individuals who can bring forth truth to the world, similar to building up the person by devotion to the guru as the answer. So tear you apart, then give you guru as the answer to give you the future. The most potent tool is humiliation, alternating with praise. It looks an awful lot like Army boot camp. Sullivan tells a story about Swami Sebastian, who was a Georgia con man who bounced around the country until he got to LA, set himself up as a Tantra guru, primarily with female devotees, go figure, who was the second coming of Christ. Sullivan actually found a drug figure he'd ripped off in his past and gave him the address of Swami Sebastian. Sebastian fled with money and his most pretty and young disciple. I can find any pictures of Swami Sebastian. It's a good story. So who are cult deprogrammers like David Sullivan? Well, they're kind of problematic. Often they kidnap people out of the cult and then deprogram them over a period of time in isolation with just the deprogrammer. This can have legal ramifications for the deprogrammer. If it doesn't work, then the person goes back to the cult and they have an ever-renewed sense of persecution by the world. Furthermore, deprogrammers might not be innocent. They might be hired by family members who are not in cults, but are just trying to get people who've rebelled against their family. One instance that I was reading about is of a cult programmer who went after an Amish woman who had joined a more liberal version of the Amish faith, and the more sort of restrictive conservative group hired a deprogrammer to kidnap her and get her to be more rigorously Amish again. So you can see this gets very human and problematic. Deprogrammers can also be used against people who are into political groups or into a more liberal form of religion, as I just said. One person's cult is another person's religion. And family members may manipulate cult deprogrammers just to get control of a person. Remember that the cult characteristics are not about any specific ideology or philosophy. It's about control of time, control of sleep, control of sexual partners, leaders who are charismatic but aloof, requesting large amounts of money, selling access to the guru or the higher levels of teachings, surrounding themselves with attendants and enforcers. If a group has a group of bodies who are basically, if they have a bunch of dudes that are working as enforcers, sign of a cult. Easy access for the wealthy and the influential, charity that never quite lines up. Specifically, Siddha Yoga has talked a big game over the years about how they do all this charity in India, and none of it has ever happened. More money on image spent than on the programming or the services. Now, the problem with cults these days is they've become big entertainment. David Koresh and the Branch Dravidians had a dramatized TV show. You have The Oath, and coming 2 seasons at least on HBO about Keith Raniere, and you have him pictured there with the brand that his little secret community of women would put on one another that are actually his initials if you look closely enough. You have Leah Remini's delightful show, Scientology in the Aftermath, talking about people coming out of Scientology and how they recover. You have the wonderful Netflix documentary, Wild Wild Country, about the followers of Osho or Rajneesh. You have innumerable documentaries on the Children of God and Heaven's Gate. And finally, you have the Manson family, who are always in the news in one way or another. So what's my point? My point is, we've talked about charismatic figures, and we've talked about cults. The Dalai Lama is not really a cult leader. He doesn't try to coerce people in. If you come, you come. He'll tell you to go learn from your own religion. If you can't, you come and be a Buddhist. Their services are relatively cheap. You don't really find, I mean, there's elements of sketchiness within his order, but Dalai Lama is a pretty good example of a religious leader who's not a new religious leader, because Tibetan Buddhism is quite old, but he's a contemporary religious leader who appeals to a lot of people and is not a cult leader. So don't see every new religious thing as a cult, but be wary if you see some of the things that I described in my lecture today. All right, have a good one. I'll catch you next time.